Thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda McGill Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Research Nebraska and Nebraska Cures. Thank you for joining us for Stem Cell Therapies, Fact versus Fiction. This is a webinar that we've put together, a Q&A, to help educate folks about LB 753. It was a bill that had a public hearing last week in front of the Health and Human Services Committee, and its intent is to require providers to get informed consent from patients who are going to be doing unproven stem cell therapies to make sure that they are fully aware that these are not FDA approved treatments. With that, I'll introduce my panelists and then we'll jump into the questions. We've got Dr. David Crouse. He's our board president and a former stem cell researcher from UNMC. He also served in leadership roles within UNMC. We've got Dr. Leigh Turner, excuse me, from University of California, Irvine. He is a national expert, written many reports and papers on this issue. And then Dr. Matt Lunning, who was recently appointed the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Clinical Research at UNMC. He'll be able to share with us what is happening in the field of stem cell research and what the process of approval really is like. So with that, Dr. Crouse, we'll get started with you. We'll start by talking a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of stem cell clinics and therapies here in Nebraska, and why are we coming to the legislature with this matter?
Well, I think a lot of people, if you exist in Nebraska, you either got mailed personal mailing for direct-to-consumer stem cell clinics, or you saw it on TV, or you read it in the newspaper. There were and still are quite a few of these clinics operating. They probably peaked out right before COVID. They began 5-6 years ago in Nebraska. At least I noticed them then, first clinics. They waned during COVID, as you might expect. There was little clinical activity of any kind. But in the past 6 months, I've noticed a couple of them were back advertising again and doing mailings in the Omaha area anyway. And I believe in Lincoln. I'm not in Lincoln, so I don't see them. But they are all offering to treat various chronic issues, pain, neuropathy, orthopedic conditions, COPD, aging, all kinds of things. Some of them are fairly straightforward and some of them are quite risky, what it boils down to. Indeed, in 2019, just the fall of 2019, there were several patients injured here in Nebraska when they received actually a bacterial infected product injected into their joints mostly, but they were badly infected, ended up in emergency rooms, and some of them for a week in intensive care to clear a really massive infection. And that led to our Attorney General being involved. Patients were suing clinics and all kinds of things like that, and the Attorney General's office stepped in and said this is false advertising. If you read the ads, you know they're so extensive that it just can't be true. It's too good to be true. And if you see ads that are too good to be true, chances are they're not true. And that's what we saw for quite a bit of time, and you still see. So the Attorney General's been involved, as you said. We had a hearing on a bill, so the legislature is involved, and we do hope that there's some change in these rogue clinics that have been prominent throughout the nation.
Dr. Crouse, can you talk a little bit more about the misleading tactics that are used to get folks in the door for these therapies?
Yeah, they advertise, as I said, newspapers and everything else, but they usually invite you to some kind of a seminar or a luncheon or a dinner or a coffee. And you go there, and I've been to them, you go there, and the people who are doing the presentations are very personable, they're well-meaning, they're sincere, they seem to be patient-oriented, very friendly. It's a nice open environment. There's backslappers and hand grabbers, at least pre-COVID they were. They make it very clear in their presentation, at least the two that I attended, that their products and processes are not covered by Medicare or other insurances for the most part. They do make it clear that they will help you get funding if you need it. Either they have loans or loans are available through colleagues of theirs, or they'll even set up GoFundMe pages for you, which I found kind of surprising to find a way to pay for it that way. They do a lot of positive testimonials with people on video or in person. The ones I saw were all in video, and they're very positive about that. Some of the patients are former, some are current. They don't present any real data. They do say things are going well and they're collecting data. They often make it very clear that they think their products are successful, although they don't guarantee success. They make it pretty clear, we can't guarantee we'll cure you, but we think we're doing a good job. They use tactics that I've observed in timeshare visitations that I've had. You know, if you sign up now, you get a discount of the day of the seminar. If you sign up this week, you get a slightly lesser discount, but you still get a discount. And if you sign up for a package deal where you get multiple treatments of the same type to treat whatever your condition is, and they say that's probably the best way to treat you, you get a bigger discount yet. And they have somebody at the back of the room to sign you up and get you on track to get treated. So it's not high pressure, but they make it very clear that they're trying to get you in the door.
Yes. Do we know how many, or about how many there are in Nebraska? And I do think it's important for people to know this isn't just an Omaha or Lincoln.
And Kearney. There are some outstate. It's a little hard to put a handle on it. There are clinics that call it regenerative medicine and call it stem cell therapy, but they're not even using cells. There's one now in Omaha that has some sort of an ultrasonic treatment that they call a stem cell treatment, that they stimulate your stem cells by using sound waves over the joints and the like. And they still advertise it as stem cell treatments, although nothing's injected. There are about 10, although some of them are umbrella. There are multiple clinics of the same parent company. There'd be one in Omaha, one in Lincoln, one in Council Bluffs, or something like that. So it's around the range of 10, but only 2 or 3 are what I would call, that's their primary thing. Many of them, the stem cell treatment is buried in a chiropractic clinic or massage clinic or something like that. It's not necessarily the front line of what they're advertising. It's one of the products they advertise.
I'm going to turn to Dr. Turner now, who's an expert on this at a national level. And I know there are some states that have like hundreds of clinics. Can you share with us what you've seen in terms of growth of this industry and the problems that are associated with it?
Sure, I can say a bit about that. Let me just see here.
Have you already gotten that done? The education.
Do you mind if I try sharing my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, just 1 second here. Okay. You can see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just try and quickly give a sense. One way of approaching this topic about 10 years ago was with the assumption that Americans left the United States and went to other countries. And so I think for some people, that's kind of still how this, sort of their notion of how this works, that Americans go to Panama or China or India, Mexico, places like that. But there has been a major change. And as we've heard, there are a lot of domestic businesses operating here in the States. Trying to track this marketplace. Paul Knopfler, a stem cell biologist at UC Davis, and I did a study back in 2016. And we were really struck by the number of businesses and clinics that we found. As Dr. Crouse mentioned, sometimes a business is one clinic, sometimes it's a franchise and it's run several of them. In total, back then, we found 351 businesses operating a total of 570 clinics. So, I think going back to that older data, it gives a sense of just how many of these businesses, how many of these facilities are operating here in the United States today. I'm going to go from that, but that's a bit dated. And so I'm going to try and take us closer to the present. The FDA had a period of enforcement discretion, which ended in May 2021. And I tried to kind of capture the marketplace, just to try and get a sense of what did it look like at that point. And in March 2021, so not that far from where we are now, I ended up finding, this is nationwide, 1,480 businesses operating 2,754 clinics, so close to 3,000 clinics. And this is all in the marketplace of, businesses that are selling unlicensed, unproven stem cell interventions. When you look at these businesses, I'm not referring to ones that are selling FDA-approved stem cell products. I'm not referring to ones that are selling, that are providing stem cell transplants for, say, cancers of the blood, where there's not just years but decades of safety and efficacy data. This is, standard of care for certain kinds of cancer. I'm talking about ones where, we're not talking about FDA-approved biologics. They're not studies being done under investigational new drug applications that have been cleared by the FDA. We're not talking about standard of care. And these are businesses where there isn't convincing safety and efficacy data. So that's the kind of scale of the marketplace now that I'm, referring to. When you go from those numbers and start getting into more details, you do see a spread across the country. So you can find 3 states, California, Florida, and Texas, where there's over 300 of these clinics. So I think of that as like the upper end of this marketplace. Now, to some extent, this is affected by population, but it's not entirely, it's not like a direct relationship between population size and number of clinics. It's a factor. Next here is, in excess of 100 clinics. There are 8 that have over 50 clinics. I found 9 in Nebraska, but Dr. Crouse pointed out, this is a bit complicated. It depends on when you're looking. It depends on what you count. So I think that some of this depends in, sort of like the frame that you set. But I would put it in that category of, it's not like a Maine or a Vermont in terms of really quite modest activity. It's a bit above that, but it's also not a California or a Florida. So I think that gives a sense of sort of where Nebraska fits into the national picture. I have more data. I'm just going to quickly show 2 quick details just to give a bit of sense of the nationwide marketplace. I kind of think of it as there's a couple different kinds of products out there in this marketplace. There's cells that have been taken from bone marrow aspirate or from fat or from peripheral blood, and those are processed and then put back into individuals. So autologous businesses will advertise autologous stem cell procedures. And then there's another big part of the marketplace where there are clinics that are marketing allogeneic stem cell products. These are typically from birth tissue derived products. And so when you look at this table, you can see some of the sources: umbilical cord blood, umbilical cord tissue, amniotic fluid, placental tissue. And so that has become a meaningful part of this marketplace. And then there's another stem cell derived products called exosomes, which went from, couldn't find them back in 2016 to about 100 clinics marketing those today. So because so much of this takes place as online advertising, you can start to get a feel for what exactly the sales pitch is. And this gives a sense of both the spread of products that are out there, but also where businesses tend to cluster and congregate. As far as data, I'll just stop here. There is this real spectrum in terms of the diseases and injuries and indications these businesses claim to treat. Pain and ortho sports medicine are out there, but you can find a lot of businesses claiming to treat neurological diseases, cardiovascular, immunological, lung respiratory. The big issue with all of these disease categories is the gap between the current state of stem cell research and the marketing representations that are made. And this is why so many researchers that come and look at this marketplace are concerned about misrepresentations and the way in which there are exaggerated pitches about safety and efficacy. I'll just end here by tying this in with Dr. Crouse's remarks that yes, there are businesses that advertise themselves as sort of standalone stem cell clinics or regenerative medicine clinics. And by number, that's the biggest part of the marketplace. But a lot of the businesses out there that are marketing stem cell procedures, that's a bit of a sideline. And maybe it's a page on a website. It's maybe a bit on the periphery of the business. And so you can find a lot of ortho clinics, a lot of integrated medicine clinics, podiatry clinics, chiropractors, medical spas, health spas, cosmetic surgery clinics, wellness clinics. I found, laser clinics, vein clinics, erectile dysfunction clinics. So it's really, there's just this kind of, it's not just a sort of single business, a stem cell clinic. There's a lot happening out there in this space. And in many instances, you have to ask the question, why are they making any claims at all about stem cells and who's actually administering them? Because, do you really want a chiropractor or a podiatrist, for example, being your purveyor of stem cells in this marketplace? So I'll stop there, but just to try and give a bit of the flavor nationwide, what's out there right now.
Yeah, that's terrific. How dangerous do you think these stem cell therapies are? And can you talk at all about some of the harms that some victims have experienced?
Yeah, so I think, when we think about dangerous, it's sort of, there's really a variety of harms that we can identify. So some of them, it's quite serious physical injuries for patients who go to these businesses where they go thinking that they're going to be helped and they end up suffering serious, severe harms. This is a New England Journal Medicine piece that documented several individuals that went to a clinic in Florida, one that ended up having a permanent injunction brought against it and has had several lawsuits brought against it. And that's because a number of the patients there went to have vision impairment addressed, and they ended up being effectively blinded by the purported stem cell procedures at this clinic. So I think what this does is it gives a sense that it's not just that people are being given misrepresentations. It's also this misrepresentations can lead people to make decisions to go to a clinic. Then they end up being administered, untested, unproven products that haven't been properly evaluated in preclinical research and clinical trials. They're given something that, is not safe, is not efficacious, and it's not really shocking that people end up being harmed out in this marketplace. So it can happen because of poor procedure at the clinic. It can happen because of poor processing at the clinic, wrong cells, wrong place, wrong dose. But it can also, we can track some of these problems back to suppliers. And so this is a report that was recently published where it wasn't just problems at clinics, there was a problem with the supplier where products appeared to be contaminated at the supplier or distributor site. That supplier then pushed umbilical cord derived stem cell products out to a variety of clinics in different states. And then to date, so far, at least 20 individuals have ended up been found to be infected by these stem cell products, been hospitalized. So that's another kind of harm where it's not just the clinic, it's sort of like this murkier space in the marketplace where it's the supplier, where contaminated products are being pushed out. So again, it's another kind of physical harm, but I think that suggests that the dominoes can start to fall even before the clinic itself. We don't know a lot about exactly how many people are harmed in this space, because usually when we learn anything, it's not the providers themselves that are disclosing it, it's people who are cleaning up the mess. There appears to be substantial underreporting of adverse events, but we don't know how many people go into this marketplace. We don't know how many people are harmed. So there's a lot of empirical questions here we don't have good answers to. Other harms, there's the misrepresentation problem that we've already heard. That affects things like informed consent, because it really kind of compromises the capacity to obtain informed consent from. And if someone is being subject to spin that's hyping up benefits and minimizing risks, even if there's some detail in the informed consent form, if all the information on Twitter and YouTube and business websites and Facebook is a different story, then I think people are being given a kind of information envelope that skews their thinking and skews their decision making. There are a lot of techniques that businesses use when they're engaged in misrepresentation. This kind of just gives a sampler, using credible research that isn't from a clinic, but is cobbled together from other places, using scientific seeming claims to make a pitch, drawing on testimonials by athletes, often local athletes or local celebrities. I can kind of carry on, but there are a number of moves that businesses make to try and make what they're doing seem legitimate. It's important to remember it's not just the misrepresentations, it's who's being targeted. And often it's individuals in quite difficult circumstances. Maybe they face a life-threatening disease. Maybe they have degenerative disease. Maybe they have a chronic disease. Maybe every day starts and ends with pain for them. And so, it's misrepresentations that appear to target particular populations. Many of them are dealing with rather difficult circumstances. Other kinds of harms, we're in a pandemic right now, as everybody knows. Some of these businesses have pivoted to the pandemic, and that's part of their pitch, making claims about immune boosters or stem cell treatments for COVID-19. We don't know how this plays out in harms, but I mean, it raises the question, are there individuals who are going to clinics and thinking they're getting their immune system boosted and therefore don't need to wear masks or don't need to be vaccinated? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I do think this is a problematic kind of claim that is directly relevant to our circumstances today. And then I'll just end by saying that, we often focus on the scam side of it. Misrepresentations are made, someone gets financially taken advantage of, or misrepresentations are made and someone ends up being harmed. But I think there are some collective harms that are connected to misrepresentations that aren't just about individuals. Part of it is it's really difficult. We live in an information environment right now where I think it's difficult for everyone, patients and their loved ones in particular, to make meaningful distinctions between FDA-approved stem cell treatments and unlicensed, unproven interventions, or evidence-based ones and those that are not, because of the way in which misrepresentation circulates through a whole variety of channels. Another factor is that when you have businesses like this, if it was just one or two, it probably wouldn't have much of an effect on the field of clinical research. But when you have close to 3,000 clinics, we don't know exactly how many people are operating in this space, but it probably is a large number. And those are individuals that are being pulled away from clinical trials that might generate meaningful knowledge. If those individuals go to a clinic and then decide they like to be in a clinical trial, that they're typically not going to be able to make it in there because there's going to be exclusion criteria. And of course, part of the problem with this is that they're being packaged as they're stem cell treatments. They're already stem cell treatments. And so again, why is someone going to go in a clinical trial where they might be randomized, they might be blinded, they might get a placebo, they might get a sham surgical procedure? If they're convinced that something's a therapy and they're going to get it by paying $5,000 or $8,000, it's pretty difficult to persuade them that they might want to think about being in a clinical trial when those kinds of assurances, can't properly be made in a legitimate clinical study. So This is just to give a sense of, some of the harms that can flow from a marketplace like this, people being blinded, suffering physical injuries, but I think it goes well beyond that.
That is a really great overarching argument, or a number of arguments that you've made. I really appreciate that. Have there been any legal repercussions towards these clinics? I mean, obviously in Nebraska, there's a pending lawsuit. What else is happening?
Yeah, so there have been a number of, there's the civil lawsuit space. So, the one clinic in Florida that I mentioned, it has been subject to a number of civil lawsuits. There's a class action lawsuit right now out in California involving a business in La Jolla that's, it appears that it's just about to be resolved. A settlement will be established. There's an ongoing class action lawsuit. So there's a fair bit in the civil litigation space. Those are usually, different kinds of claims will get made. Someone suffered a physical injury, someone's been subject to false and deceptive, misleading advertising, and then suffered financial losses, problems with informed consent. So that's kind of the civil law side. There's a much larger and more complicated story there, but that's just a bit of a flavor. The FDA, I think, to be fair to them, has stepped up its game, is more active in this space than they were, say, a decade ago. There's the business out in Florida that I mentioned is subject to a permanent injunction. There's a chain of businesses that started out here in California where the FDA is in federal court in California seeking a permanent injunction order. That case has been going on for some time. We don't know the punchline, we don't know the outcome, but it's probably near a resolution, and that could lead to another permanent injunction. So this is where, courts permanently enjoin businesses for making these marketing representations. But of course, it's a long haul to go to court. And, these are kind of brawls that take place over time. They're costly, labor intensive. So I don't want to trivialize the challenge the FDA and the DOJ, Department of Justice, face with these cases, but that's one legal response. The Federal Trade Commission is involved in this space. There are two businesses here in Orange County where I'm sitting that the Federal Trade Commission sued them, reached a settlement. Right now, the FTC is working with the Attorney General in Georgia, pursuing action against a business, again, a franchise in the state of Georgia that's been involved in making what's alleged to be deceptive advertising. Several states' attorney general's offices have sued businesses. I've picked two, one of them from Nebraska. So this is a case that directly involves your state attorney general. The one on the left is one that took place and involves the Arkansas attorney general. Interesting thing about that is that it did include a business that was making marketing representations about stem cells for COVID-19. And it also used it wasn't strictly English language based. And this is often a conversation where there's not much discussion of ethnicity or language or linguistic differences. And I think that could be part of this conversation as well, that if we're doing English language searches, we may be missing some of the businesses that are operating in the space and not realizing that there's even more going on than we might think. The New York Attorney General recently secured a $5.1 million court judgment against a particular business, Park Avenue Stem Cell. So this was resolved near the end of 2021. So I think what this suggests is that there appears to be a stepping up in interest and activity on the part of states' attorney general's offices, which I think is a positive development given the marketing claims and misrepresentations that are made. State medical boards sometimes react, and in this case, it's a cardiologist in Florida who ran a clinic. He ended up having his medical license revoked after a careful investigative and deliberative process. That, sometimes physicians or other licensed healthcare practitioners are disciplined as a result of marketing risk misrepresentations, operating outside professional standard of care, failure to obtain informed consent. They can be subject to a variety of disciplinary actions of varying degrees of severity. And then state legislatures, which I think is directly relevant to what you're doing. There are some state legislators that have decided that acknowledging the importance of federal regulations and the role of the FDA, there are meaningful steps they can take. And many states have made a move similar to what Nebraska is contemplating, which is focusing on making sure that people have the information they need to make more informed, more meaningful kinds of choices, in particular by letting people know that if they're getting a product that's unlicensed and unproven, they really need to know that. And I think it's an attempt to counter a lot of the spin that's out there and help make sure that people appreciate that and understand that they're contemplating spending $5,000 or $10,000 or $12,000, whatever, for something that doesn't have an FDA biologics license in effect. And I think, behind that doesn't have the safety net efficacy data that would lead to getting a licensure from the FDA. So I think this is another meaningful development that we're seeing. State legislatures thinking about what they can do in this space to better protect patients and to better protect consumers.
Can you real briefly just touch on, if this is falls under the FDA, how was this allowed to happen? I guess that there are all these therapies out there and folks have been able to evade them.
Yeah, that's a complicated one. I think the FDA has done a good job of trying to clarify what the regulations are and try and be as forthright as possible in terms of how the FDA federal regulations interprets key concepts like same surgical procedure or minimal manipulation, homologous. There are some technical terms and concepts that the FDA applies. I think the FDA has done a lot to help businesses operating in this space, sponsors, universities, a whole different host of parties, understand what those regulations are and understand how the FDA interprets them. The problem is that there are some regulatory exceptions in federal regulations. They're usually narrow and they're quite well defined, like the same surgical procedure exception, where it's, you're allowed to move fat from one part of the body to the other, to another, if you're not manipulating it. You can move a vein from one part of the body to the other. That's not supposed to mean that you can take fat, you can perform a liposuction procedure, process it, create stromal vascular fraction, and then inject into somebody's eyeball. So it's meant to be a narrow bounded exception to regulations, that what businesses will do is they often take these exceptions to regulations where you need to have a biologics license, and they claim that what they're doing sits inside those regulatory exceptions. Even though if you look at the regulations and you look at the FDA guidance documents and warning letters and everything else, you can quickly see that the businesses don't fall in these regulatory gaps. They claim they do. So they just basically put a shingle out there on the internet, claim that they don't need FDA approval, or say that what they're doing is part of the practice of medicine or a surgical procedure. It isn't subject to FDA oversight. That becomes the pitch. And businesses can then operate like that for years, charging individuals day after day, year after year. And it really just becomes a question of, does the FDA or the FTC or any other entity eventually show up? And sometimes they do, and there's meaningful action, and other times, other businesses that are much like ones that have got warning letters from the FDA just continue to operate unimpeded. And I think in part it's because, while the FDA is a large organization and while it has investigators and inspectors, they can only really deal with a small subset of this marketplace. And so there's a way in which this marketplace has become so large that it's overwhelmed regulators. Now, if we could unwind the clock and go back to 2002 and 2003, if there'd been a really robust regulatory response then over the next several years, maybe this marketplace would have never emerged. But of course, that's not what happened. And there's a certain point where, the box is opened up to such an extent that it's very difficult to put it back in again. And so Peter Marks, for example, the head of a key FDA agency right now, he kind of talks about this as a Wild West marketplace. And so it's interesting that even federal regulators who are directly involved in overseeing this marketplace, readily acknowledge that this has become a kind of Wild West marketplace. And I think they talk about having a kind of a lack of bandwidth, that they just don't have the resources to really be systematic and thorough in terms of dealing with the marketplace like this. And I think that's the environment that we're talking about. I think that's why other entities like states attorney general's offices and state legislatures are stepping up, trying to deal with something that is probably not going to ever be entirely addressed by the FDA.
I appreciate that analysis.
Thanks.
If you would stop sharing your screen for a moment, I have some questions for Dr. Lunning now. We've talked a lot about these unproven therapies, but there are some really great stem cell therapies out there that have been around for a while even. Can you talk to us about some of those great things happening in the world of stem cells?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the therapies that have been around for decades now is our ability to harvest a patient's own stem cells and be able to put them in the freezer, which allows us to give very high doses of chemotherapy in hopes of eradicating their disease. And typically this is used for blood type cancers, specifically lymphomas. And what we do is we give very high doses of chemotherapy and then rescue their bone marrow with their own stem cells. So somehow the biology is very complex, but we can pull out stem cells, freeze them, and re-inject them into the same catheter that they came out of, and those stem cells will home back to the bone marrow and grow up from baby cells back to adult cells. And so that's a technology that's been around for decades. We fine-tuned it, in regards to how do we safely get the number of stem cells that we need, that we don't put people on apheresis machines for more days than they need, because there are consequences, to being on those machines, or potential consequences to being on those machines, for days if you don't need a certain number of stem cells. But we do continue to do research on stem cells too. In fact, there are research going on and looking at the right number of stem cells that you would need. All these are done in the setting of a clinical trial, which has the process of informed consent when you talk about what standard of care is or what you would do outside of a clinical trial. And sometimes the clinical trials will have standard of care as part of an arm. And what you're asking in regards to the clinical trial is, can we improve upon standard of care by either, for instance, using the number of stem cells, where we would go to a higher dose to try and decrease in our autologous stem cell world the number of days with low counts, or helping engraft the bone marrow, meaning where the bone marrow returns to function based upon how many platelet transfusions or what the platelet count is at a certain day after a bone marrow transplant. So there's still research going on in this space, even though it is many decades old.
And there are great clinical trials and research being done to try to treat other things as well, that maybe aren't being offered at these clinics.
Yeah, I think that, with regards to what we're doing with the stem cell, there is, or even the immune system in general, there's clinical trials going on trying to manipulate the immune system. One of the things that I think Dr. Turner talked about is unmanipulated, stem cells, but we are now, investigating how to either grow the immune system from these stem cells, or manipulate them, or manipulate more mature, bits of the immune system to target patients with cancer, both on the blood cancer side of things, but also in other malignancies.
I'll talk a little bit about these positive things happening and how they're being used here in Nebraska.
Well, I can speak to, the one clinical trial I was referring to was a clinical trial that we participated or are participating in, which was looking at stem cell dose and trying to use that as one of the variables to hopefully enhance the, chances of an individual from being cured from their aggressive large cell lymphoma, which is a type of B cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Some of the other areas where we're using, the immune system that may go beyond the stem cell. I mean, the initial state of it is that these differentiate over time. I use the stem cell as referencing like a baby cell, whereas over time your immune system evolves to become adolescent, teenager, and then adult cells. And so we can harvest different stages of those immune cells. And for instance, we do what's called chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapy. So T cells are a very mature part of your immune system. They're like the security guards of the body. And we basically harvest those T cells, re-engineer them to kind of put a receptor on the surface of the T cells that would essentially are more trained to target a specific, flag on the outside of both cancer cells. And sometimes we accept that it could target, good parts of the immune system too, and re-inject those cells back into the individuals and try to eradicate their cancer.
Being not from a university medical system, I don't know much about an institutional review board and how that is used in the research process. And I'm sure most legislators or members of the public don't really understand that either. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the institutional review board or the IRB is a big part of any clinical trial, both regards to the reviewing of the protocol in itself, but also what is called the informed consent. So this is the document that has several tenets in it about discussing about what the therapy is, how many subjects are going to be in the study, what's the goal of the study, what are the risks and the benefits, Is there any perception that there would be direct benefit to the subject if they were to enroll? And are they being compensated for being in the trial? And this is a living document, meaning that informed consent just doesn't start and stop with signing of that document if you're going into the clinical trial. If the study evolves over time, or as new information about the efficacy or the safety of the study evolves, there can be reconsenting or re-education of the subject about the clinical trial, to where they sign a new informed consent along the way. And there's the possibility as the trials mature, for those subjects to ask questions, or what are the results of the trial, and really there's a principal investigator and a research team behind them, but there's also the ability to contact the IRB if you feel there's a concern, or to report a concern about the trial that can be then further investigated. So as a member of our IRB, I take the informed consent and the review process very, very seriously. I think being part of that has made me a better investigator when I'm my own PI on my own studies. But it is a very complex process. We try in the informed consents to put these informed consents in layman's terms. And so taking something incredibly complex like stem cells or CAR T cells, and bringing it down to a level that patients or subjects can understand what they're getting into, is a very complex and necessarily a time, can be a significant time to do that.
So when you have gone through clinical trials or in that process, and something's looking very positive, what is that FDA approval process like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's many ways to frame positive, in regards to a clinical trial. So a clinical trial that's trying to accrue 200 subjects, for instance, if they rapidly accrue 150 subjects out of the 200, that's an encouraging trial because it's accruing, it's getting to its subjects. Now, is it a positive trial? And then it kind of goes into what's positive from the phase of the trial, because early phase trials are really looking at the question of what's the dosing, what's safe, and there may not be any perceived direct benefit to the subject entering into the study, and that's part of the nature of the understanding of the informed consent. Versus phase 2 trials is really where you think that you've nailed the dose of what you feel may be safe, but then really looking at what's efficacious. And so if you find a positive trial that shows that there's potential efficacy with manageable toxicity, then that could be perceived as a positive trial. A phase 3 trial is typically where you're challenging standard of care with your experimental arm of a trial. And so in that regards, a positive trial there usually is meeting an endpoint which is felt to be a meaningful endpoint. And the goal of that trial is to either beat or exceed the standard of care, or at least in some trials in phase 3s and non-inferiority trials, to show that it is equally as efficacious or as safe as the other arm. And so really, I think it's perception about what a positive trial is. It could be as simple as it's accruing well, or this is, a promising trial, always doesn't end up with, meaning that it met its primary endpoint. And there are studies, I can give you an example of the most positive negative trial, meaning that the trial looked good, but it just didn't meet its primary endpoint. And, so we try to have the foresight and the muddy crystal ball of planning these studies that, take 5 to 7 years, if not even longer in some diseases, to report out. And what we forget is that the science evolves. If there's anything that not to go there, but to go there, since Dr. Turner already went there, is talking about the pandemic. Science evolves. And so if our opinion stayed the same as it did in March of 2020, and fast forward now to January of 2022, if we're in the science business and our opinions haven't evolved since then, or in our feelings and our emotions, then really I think that we're not as a species evolving. I mean, that's just my own opinion. But I think it comes down to, that's what research and clinical trials are. They're meant to be, in the purest sense, something that is very sacred, in my opinion, between the subject and the research team. That's something that should be respected, and done to the best of everyone's ability.
I was going to ask you just why is it important to use a clinical trial process, but you kind of summed it up there in those comments. So I'll go back to Dr. Turner there to talk a little bit more about the FDA. And you had mentioned that they had that hold period and they're back in action, or perhaps is there anything else to say about the FDA, or do you feel like you summed that up pretty well as well?
I think we've seen step ups in terms of, warning letters, untitled letters. I didn't mention it, but over that period of enforcement discretion, the FDA sent out 400, what they called "it has come to our attention" letters. So there are 400 businesses somewhere out there in the United States that have received letters where the FDA has basically said, we noticed that you're marketing purported stem cell treatments. We remind you that you need to be in compliance with our regulations. The work that I've done, I mean, I've tried to track businesses, but I have noticed there's a lot of fluidity in this marketplace as businesses come and go. Some of them have disappeared. So some of them, a segment of this marketplace may have disappeared because they're small businesses operating in the pandemic and they just can't really keep going. It's possible that some of them, even if they didn't get a warning letter from the FDA, that shot across the bow was enough to make them decide to check out. And maybe they're still operating as a podiatry clinic or a chiropractor's clinic, but they're not marketing stem cells any longer. So there could be some things happening behind the scenes that aren't readily visible in the public domain that could be encouraging signs. There hasn't been, sort of post-enforcement discretion, some big nationwide crackdown where, 150 businesses have got warning letters from the FDA. So if people are waiting for a single big bang moment where this marketplace disappears, we haven't seen that. I'm not sure we are going to see that. I will say that when it comes to businesses making claims about stem cells for COVID-19, and there is credible research in that area, just to emphasize that point, but there's also kind of, claims that go well beyond that credible evidence, making it seem like we have, exosome treatments for COVID-19 already. I would say the FDA and the FTC have been pretty responsive. There's a COVID-19 fraud task force, and I think that's an example of where we are seeing quite an effective regulatory response where it's not just the FDA, it's the FDA, the FBI, the FTC. Maybe there's a model there that would be more effective in terms of dealing with claims about stem cells for ALS, for example, or Parkinson's disease. A little bit more interagency interaction and maybe filing criminal charges a little more often would make a real dent in this marketplace. I don't think it's necessary to deal with 3,000 clinics. I think sending a signal to the marketplace, a meaningful signal, that there can be real consequences from selling unlicensed and unproven products that are risky. If a couple individuals lose their medical license, so there's significant financial penalties, I think that could make a real difference. When the financial incentives are that it makes a lot of sense from a financial perspective to operate in the space, and the likelihood of bad outcomes are very low, I think that pulls in the scam artists, the entrepreneurial types in a risky way that's dangerous for patient safety and public health. So just add those remarks.
Is there anything else I missed in terms of your national expertise that you want to share?
I think we've covered a lot as a group here and really appreciate your questions. I think it's one reminder that we've heard from the presentations here today is that, there's a lot of credible stem cell research. Sometimes clinical trials, when they take place, we don't end up with a safe and efficacious FDA-approved product, but when we do learn something meaningful, we learn that something was being tested, meet clinical trial endpoints. Maybe that means the study design needs to change, or maybe there's an avenue where what's often described as a failed trial, where it's a negative outcome. A failed trial can often be actually a rather successful trial. When you report that, other researchers can then go on, try other cell types, other cell doses, other study designs. And so I would just add that this very incremental process, it's difficult actually developing safe and efficacious therapies. The clinical trial route, it's incremental, it takes time. And so I would just add, it's not fair to individuals who are facing life-threatening condition to say, just be patient. I mean, they're patients and they're impatient, understandably so, as any of us would be. But for many of these diseases, it's easy to make a claim that there's a treatment. It's often very difficult to actually come up with a treatment that actually works. So I would just add that really coming up with effective products is a challenging undertaking.
I agree. I can just maybe dovetail on that a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I've been a big advocate of what would be called the Journal of Negative Studies, because we are fixated in the society on only positive things, or the perception of what is positive gets reported, and there's no value in something which didn't meet its primary endpoint. And that leads to, the replication of clinical research that wouldn't have otherwise been done had that study or been peer reviewed and in a journal. But sometimes there isn't that avenue, and often we say there's in academia, we say there's a place for every article, but I'm not sure that's always true in my experience. So again, I agree. Is that we have to take, we continue to do research, but we can continue to, you should be reporting that research also.
All right. Well, before we wrap things up, I'm going to go back to Dr. Crouse and just talk about the bill momentarily, and why Dr. Crouse is LB 753 so important.
Well, I think it's kind of a first step, as we said at the hearing. We're waiting a little bit on what happens with the Attorney General's suit, which is going to be heard February 1st. And just so everybody knows, there's a parallel suit going on in Iowa. They worked this together, the Iowa and Nebraska Attorney Generals. The Iowa suit is based both on false advertising and on targeting elderly populations. They have a bill or a law in Iowa that you can't specifically target elderly for these kinds of procedures, and to basically entice them into it. And so they're being sued in Iowa on two different cases, false advertising and targeting a particular population. We don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. I hope that it's positive for us. There are also suits by some of the patients against the same clinics and physicians for the same actions. I think they're the same ones that you mentioned, Leigh, in your collection of lawsuits that are going on, because it was a product that was actually defective, not the clinic. But we're waiting to see where those go. We do look at this as kind of a first step. I'll make a comment. Just this morning, I went and looked at several of the clinics that have been in the Omaha, Lincoln, and Kearney areas. Two of them have dropped the word COPD from what they treat. They don't list that anymore. I would say it was the most risky thing that they were treating. They're still doing osteoarthritis and back pain and joints and things like that, but they're no longer doing COPD and some of the other more risky things. So I think some clinics may be edging away from the places that I think the FDA would come in and threaten them more quickly if they saw that they were operating in an area that was more risky for patients. Quite frankly, most of the injections for arthritis, if they're autologous, collected in the clinic and things like that, it's fairly low risk to the patients, but also the biggest risk is in their pocketbook. And they do have a big risk in their pocketbook with not much chance of outcome. So just kind of a closing comment. It's a little bit of wait to see for where this goes in the future.
Well, thank you. I haven't seen any questions from anyone who joined us.
There's one.
Lisa.
Sorry, I don't know how to operate my Zoom thing. I'm old school. Senator Art and I were just talking, and he did wonder who actually does the stem cell injections in these clinics. Is it a licensed physician? Is it a PA? Yes. Is it anybody? Is it a massage therapist?
I attended two different seminars. One of them, it was a chiropractor. That's who they claimed it was. The chiropractor was doing the injections, and the other one, it was a nurse. And so it was pretty widespread. None of them were physicians, and the ones that I was involved in. Now, I do know that two of the orthopedic clinics, one operating in Lincoln and one operating in Omaha, those are big orthopedic clinics that are now offering some stem cell therapies for joints using bone marrow aspirates. And those are orthopedic physicians and or their direct hands, somebody else in the clinic. But we do know, I think we heard yesterday, or not yesterday, Friday, that the clinic in Lincoln is no longer doing that. So I think some of the people are watching the law and what's happening with the Attorney General and what's happening nationwide, and they may be backing off a little bit. I don't know, Leigh, whether that's something you've observed or not, but I seem to be seeing that here. We have a very small number of clinics, so it may be easier to see on a bigger scale.
There's some scaling back of claims. There's some rebranding. Maybe businesses stop making claims about stem cells and move to, orthobiologics or make vague references to regenerative medicine. So I think there are some changes in the marketing pitch. As far as who puts the cells in, I mean, it's, as you said, there's, it really depends on which business you're looking at. It could be a licensed medical practitioner. Some businesses that I've seen, what they'll do is maybe you'll have a chiropractor's office or someone else. But what they'll do is twice a week, they'll have a relationship with some clinician in the community. And so someone will come in for 2 hours and perform whatever procedures are on for that week. So sometimes it's not, you'll have a clinic that it's really quite astonishing that they're anywhere near this space, but it's because they've brokered some kind of understanding with the clinician. That person may have no real training or expertise relative to the stem cell procedures that they're doing, but that's their way of trying to kind of bring in a licensed medical practitioner to provide the procedures.
I'll add a little thing there. There's a business advertised as R3 Stem Cells, and they are an international operation. They will find you a physician in your area or close to you who will administer stem cells that they provide. And they will provide the advertising, they will provide IRB oversight, they say. They will provide the actual products and the instructions on how to administer it. And they're recruiting, if you go to their website, they are recruiting practitioners to administer their products. And they'll sell you a package, the whole thing, the advertising, the brochures, all the background information, testimonials, they provide those, and then they provide the products. So they're recruiting physicians to do that, or I'll say practitioners, they aren't necessarily physicians. So look up R3 Stem Cells. You'll be able to go on there, and if you want to administer stem cells, you can set up your own business. It's that easy, actually.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that was our only question. And thank you, Senator Arch, if you can hear us, and Senator Lathrop for co-sponsoring this bill. And thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Crouse, Dr. Lunning, Dr. Turner, for joining us here today. We appreciate all the information you've been able to share.